Sometimes, a cry for help doesn't sound like a scream. It sounds like the scrape of rusted metal in the rain, like the silent stare of a pup too weak to bark. She was just a German shepherd, forgotten, broken, left for dead, in a place no one was meant to survive. But something in her still believed in kindness, in second chances. And when a man found her buried beneath rust and rain, he didn't just save her, she saved him. This isn't just a story about rescue. It's about what happens when love refuses to leave, and a dog teaches a town how to hope again. The rain had a stubborn way of settling over Cedar Brook, thin at first like breath against glass, then thickening into a cold mist that clung to every pine needle and gutter. It was a town that seemed made for secrets, shrouded in fog, tucked between ridges of damp evergreens, and stitched together by winding roads that remembered more than they revealed. Officer Mason Wyatt knew every turn of those roads. He had driven them for nearly 15 years, long enough to know when the silence meant peace, and when it meant something had gone wrong. Mason was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, with the kind of face that looked carved more than born angles, softened by time, but not yet worn out. His dark brown hair had begun to silver around the temples, and his beard, though short, showed the same quiet surrender to age. People in Cedar Brook called him that quiet officer, not unkindly. Since losing his wife 3 years ago, Mason had become a man of routines and silences, the kind who rarely smiled but always showed up. He wasn't unfriendly, just frayed at the edges. His 5-year-old son, Finn, was the only thing that made those edges feel like they still had purpose. That Thursday night, Mason was on a solo patrol in the south sector of town, where the trees gave way to a gravel path that curved behind the old industrial area. The junkyard lay just past the bend, a skeletal sprawl of rusted refrigerators, warped car frames, and dumpsters that breathed smoke when the wind hit right. The rain had picked up again, steady and cold, tapping against the windshield in a rhythm too sharp to ignore. He clicked off the radio, rolled down his window, and was about to move on when he heard it, a metallic scrape faint, hesitant, followed by a whimper. It wasn't wind, not an animal either, not the kind that belonged out here. Mason's hand moved to the flashlight on his belt. He parked the cruiser, left the engine running, and stepped out into the wet dark. The air smelled of oil, mold, and time. He moved slowly past a stack of broken vending machines and paused when he heard it again, clearer this time, a muffled clink of metal followed by something softer, a cry. The beam of his flashlight caught on a pile of trash bags that had collapsed around a rusted crate, half buried in muck. The crate was rectangular, dented inwards like something had pushed from inside. Blackened bags sagged around it, their surfaces slick with rain. Mason knelt, peeled one back, then another. When he pulled away the last layer, the light found a paw black and tan, trembling, jammed between the twisted bars of the crate. "Jesus!" he muttered, reaching forward. Inside was a young German shepherd, no more than 6 months old, with black and tan fur now matted with brown sludge and blood. She was curled into herself, ribs visible beneath her coat. Her ears twitched weakly, and one of her front paws was bleeding, claw cracked down the center. Mason's breath caught. There was no sound from her, just eyes, wide and glassy, locked on him, as if she was still deciding whether he was real. Mason reached for the latch, but it broke off and his hand rusted through. He dropped his flashlight and unbuttoned his jacket, sliding it off. "Hey, girl," he whispered, voice softer than the rain. She didn't flinch, didn't move. The inside of the crate stank of urine, old blood, and fear. As he spread his jacket across the wet ground beside her, he noticed the marks on the back wall lines dug into the metal with something sharp. 3 words scratched deeply and unevenly into the steel. "She still believes." He froze. The letters weren't scrawled. They were careful, intentional. The kind of message someone left when they didn't know what else to do, either for her or for themselves. She didn't whimper. She didn't crawl out. She just watched. "All right," he said gently. "Let's get you out of here." He reached in slowly, palms open. She was stiff as stone, but when his hand slid beneath her chest and legs, she didn't resist. Just a soft, dry shudder ran through her frame. He lifted her like she might break, cradled her against his chest, and wrapped her in the jacket. Her body radiated heat, not the warm kind, but the fevered, desperate kind. Her nose pressed once against his collar. Then nothing. Back at the cruiser, Mason eased her into the passenger seat, adjusting the heat and turning off the overhead lights. For a moment, he just sat there, drenched, staring at the creature beside him. Her eyes were open, unmoving, as if sleep had become something she didn't trust anymore. Dispatch crackled on the radio. Mason ignored it. He picked up the mic and said quietly, "Unit 12, detour. I'll be out of service for a while." On the drive back to town, rain swept in waves across the windshield, blurring the world into a watercolor of street lamps and shadows. The puppy didn't move, but she didn't look away either. Mason caught her gaze again and again at red lights still, searching, quiet. A part of him felt like she was watching for the moment he'd disappear. He didn't. When they reached the station garage, Mason didn't carry her inside. Instead, he made a temporary bed in the back office old towels, a warm blanket, the space heater he used in winter. He placed her gently down and sat beside her on the floor. The smell of rust and blood still lingered, but she was here, safe. For a moment, Mason allowed himself to breathe. He didn't know yet about the chip beneath her fur or the false records tied to her ID. He didn't know the name Troy R. or how a junkyard crate would lead to a months-old case file from Idaho. All he knew was this: she shouldn't have survived the night, and yet here she was. He looked down at her again. She blinked once, slowly. "You still believe?" he whispered. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The next morning came slow and gray, as if the clouds above Cedar Brook had decided to pause over the town and rest a while longer. The fog had thickened, seeping into the pine branches, draping every rooftop in silence. Inside the small veterinary clinic, tucked beside the library, its shingled roof streaked with moss and its sign crooked but clean. Annie Delgado was already unlocking the front door when she saw the cruiser pull into the gravel lot. Annie was in her late 20s, slender and sharp-featured, with a streak of auburn hair she never bothered to tame, and eyes that seemed older than the rest of her. People often mistook her for fragile, but beneath her soft sweaters and quiet demeanor was a will shaped by loss. 2 years ago, a rescue pup named Jasper had died during her shift, an allergic reaction too fast, a dose of epinephrine too late. Since then, Annie carried a kind of quiet intensity into every case, as if trying to undo that single moment by saving every dog that came after. Mason stepped out of the cruiser, his uniform wrinkled, his expression unreadable. He opened the passenger door and lifted out the white German shepherd, still wrapped in the jacket. The pup barely moved, but her eyes flickered toward Annie as they approached. "This the one from the junkyard?" she asked, voice low. Mason nodded. "Found her in a crate, barely breathing. No chip info, no ID, but someone left her a message." Annie raised a brow. "Message?" He paused. 3 words, scratched into the metal wall: "She still believes." Annie didn't respond, only gestured for him to follow. Inside, the clinic smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic. Soft jazz played from an old speaker near the desk. Annie led them into exam room 2, the quieter of the 2 spaces, away from barking, away from sound. They placed the pup, now beginning to shiver, on the table. Annie worked quickly, slipping on gloves, checking vitals, whispering to herself in short, sharp phrases. Dehydrated, malnourished, lacerations, cracked paw pad. Her voice softened when she reached the pup's head, brushing damp fur from her eyes. "But you're still here, aren't you?" she murmured. "Harper," Mason said suddenly. Annie looked up. "I don't know why, but that name came to me last night. Feels right." She nodded slowly. "Harper it is." They ran warm fluids, antibiotics, gentle sedatives. Annie moved like a pianist, precise, deliberate, knowing when not to press too hard. Harper didn't flinch, didn't growl, didn't look away from Mason, even once. By the time they finished, the pup was swaddled in fresh towels and resting in the heated recovery kennel. Her breath was shallow but steady. Mason stayed by the window. Annie cleaned silently. "You have someone to look after?" she asked without turning. He hesitated. "Yeah, my boy, Finn. I remember him, big blue eyes, never talks." Mason gave a dry smile. "Hasn't said a word since his mother passed." Annie didn't reply. Instead, she walked to the small office fridge, pulled out a juice box, and handed it to Mason. "He should come meet her. He doesn't do well with new things." She's not a thing. That afternoon, Mason returned. This time, he wasn't alone. Finn trailed behind him like a shadow, small in his rain boots and puffy coat. He was 5, but looked younger, thin, pale, with cheeks still round from childhood, but eyes already carrying the weight of silence. His dark brown hair clung damp to his forehead. In his arms, he held a battered sketch pad. When Annie opened the door to the recovery room, Harper stirred. She didn't rise, didn't bark, just lifted her head, blinking slowly, eyes landing directly on Finn. The boy froze. Mason crouched beside him, whispered something that Finn didn't answer. Annie stepped back. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then, Finn walked forward. He crossed the room slowly, boots squeaking. He stopped in front of the kennel, crouched low, and looked in. Harper watched him without blinking. Finn leaned closer. And then, with the softest breath of voice, he whispered something no one else could hear. Annie's hand went to her chest. Mason stared, that mouth slightly open. It was the first sound Finn had made in nearly 2 years. Harper blinked once. Then, as if sensing something sacred had passed between them, she lowered her head onto her paws and gave a quiet sigh. From that moment, Harper's eyes followed Finn wherever he went. Over the next few days, the boy and the dog grew into each other's orbit like twin moons. Finn began to draw again, first quiet pencil strokes of trees and shapes. Then one day, unmistakably, Harper's face. He brought his sketch pad to the clinic every time he visited, sitting cross-legged beside her pen, sometimes humming under his breath. Harper, though still weak, would crawl closer to the gate when she heard his boots. She no longer whimpered in sleep. Her tail thumped barely audible, but present. Annie watched it all unfold with quiet awe. One night, as Mason prepared to take Finn home, he noticed something new in his son's lunchbox. It was a folded piece of paper, a drawing. On it, Finn had drawn himself standing under a tree. Beside him, a white dog. Beneath the drawing, in uneven block letters, were 2 words: Harper stays. Mason held the paper like a relic. Later that week, Annie walked into the recovery room with Harper's updated chart and paused. Harper wasn't in her bed. She was curled up beneath the small cot that had been set up when Finn had insisted on spending afternoons with her. The boy was lying on top, asleep, one hand dangling off the edge, fingers resting gently on Harper's shoulder. Annie didn't wake them. That night, as Mason stood outside the clinic waiting for Finn, the air smelled faintly of cedar and rain. Harper padded softly across the floor inside, not yet running, but no longer flinching. In the dim clinic light, she looked not like a victim, but a sentinel. Annie joined Mason on the porch, wrapping a cardigan around her arms. "He talks to her," Mason said quietly. "Every day." Annie nodded. "She listens. She sleeps by his bed now. She knows." Neither spoke for a while. Then Mason said, "He told me a story last night, about a knight and a wolf who guarded the gates of a silent city." Annie raised an eyebrow. "I asked him where he heard it," Mason continued. "He said, 'She told me.'" Inside, Finn opened his eyes. Harper stirred beside him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She was already listening. The third morning after Harper's rescue unfolded under a brittle sky, pale as unpolished silver. The rain had stopped, but moisture clung to the leaves, dripping from the needles of the pines that encased the town of Cedarbrook like ancient sentinels. Everything was damp, quiet, watchful, as though the whole town had collectively held its breath. Officer Mason Wyatt stood by his kitchen sink, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Outside the window, his backyard was still draped in fog, and beyond that, the tree line hovered like a memory. Finn sat at the table behind him, legs swinging gently beneath the chair, sketchbook open before him. He wasn't drawing yet, just staring at the blank page with the calm, serious patience only children like Finn could have. There was a knock at the door, soft, deliberate, 2 taps followed by 1 long pause. Mason set down his mug and moved to answer it. Standing on the porch was Mrs. Eloise Marin, wrapped in her long wool coat despite the spring air. She was in her early 70s, with snow-white hair pulled into a tight twist, and small, pale hands always gloved in faded leather. Her eyes were clouded slightly with age, but still held a sharpness, like someone who remembered more than she let on. "Eloise," Mason said, surprised. "You all right?" She gave a short nod. "May I come in for a moment?" "Of course." She stepped inside with the air of someone who didn't visit often but had rehearsed this moment many times. She removed her gloves slowly, eyeing Finn as he sat quiet at the table. The boy didn't speak or look up, but his pencil had begun to move, slow, steady strokes. Eloise looked back at Mason. "I wasn't sure I should say anything. People already think I'm the town's haunted mailbox." He frowned. "I don't think that." She exhaled, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper, creased like it had been held too long. She pressed it into Mason's palm. "I left this under your door 2 mornings ago," she said. "Didn't sign it. Didn't know if I had the right." Mason opened it slowly. The handwriting was tight and neat. It wasn't a stray. Someone put her there. "I live 3 houses from the edge of the scrap lot," she continued. "On Tuesday night, I saw headlights sweeping the back fence. Not quick, like someone turning around. Slow, deliberate, a box truck, old, no license plate light. I didn't go out. I used to be braver, but now I just watch." Mason's fingers tightened around the note. "Did you see who was driving?" She shook her head. "Too dark, but I saw them get out. A man, tall, heavy shoulders. He opened the back of the truck, pulled something out, and dropped it near the heap." She looked down, then up again. "It wasn't trash. I could feel it." Mason exhaled through his nose, the breath quiet but sharp. "You didn't report it?" Eloise's face tightened. "I've reported things before, Officer Wyatt. No one listens to old women who say they saw monsters in the fog." He gave a small nod, no anger in his expression. "Well, I do." A moment of stillness passed. Then from the table, Finn's pencil stopped scratching. He turned the page and, without looking up, began drawing something new. Mason walked over to stand behind him, Eloise peering over his shoulder. The image was unmistakable. A metal box, dented, rusted, half-submerged, in what looked like a mound of garbage. And on the side, faint but clear in Finn's pencil strokes, were 3 words etched with uneven pressure. "She still believes." Mason froze. His throat dried instantly. He'd never told Finn about that. Not out loud, not in the car, not even on the phone. Eloise stepped back, lips parted. "Did you show him a photo?" she asked. Mason shook his head slowly. "No." They both turned to Finn, who kept drawing, adding small details to the wires twisting from the crate's edges. The boy's face remained placid, eyes steady. He didn't look at them. He just continued. "Children see things differently," Eloise whispered. "Sometimes the way we used to, before we stopped believing it mattered." That evening, Mason called the station and requested access to old reports about illegal dumping and suspicious vehicle sightings in the South Sector. The receptionist on duty, a no-nonsense woman named Callie with a permanent pen tucked behind her ear, told him she'd leave the files in his mailbox. When he arrived, the box was overflowing. Complaints from the last 6 months. A pattern was emerging, unmarked vehicles near the lot, strange animal sounds at night, the stench of something beyond trash. Back home, Harper lay curled at the foot of Finn's bed, her breath rhythmic, her body still healing, but no longer stiff. Mason stood at the doorway, watching them both. He clutched the drawing Finn had made, now carefully folded in his coat pocket. He couldn't explain it, not rationally. Maybe Finn had heard him talking to Annie. Maybe he saw the stress in Mason's shoulders and imagined the rest. But something inside Mason apart, dulled by years of police reports and clean exits, refused to write it off. That part was whispering, "Believe him." The next day, Mason returned to the junkyard with a camera, boots, and gloves. The crate was still there, untouched. The rain had washed away most of the blood and mud, but the scratches remained deep enough to catch sunlight, jagged enough to pull a thread. He photographed the angles, measured the ground around it, and found tire tracks, faint but wide and unusual. Box truck, rear wheel, older model. He took castings, sent them in. He stood in the silence afterward, surrounded by rusted machines and a scent of old oil. And he whispered something almost like a prayer. "She still believes. So do I." The air inside Cedarbrook Veterinary Clinic was calm that morning, at least on the surface. The soft whir of heating vents hummed beneath the sound of gentle footsteps and the occasional bark echoing from the back kennels. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. Harper had been making progress for days now, steady, quiet, almost miraculous. She responded to Finn's voice with subtle tail wags, followed him from room to room with careful paws, and even began eating from his hand. But today something broke. It happened in the late morning when one of the junior techs, Cassie Tran, a 19-year-old with bright pink laces on her sneakers and a heart too soft for this job, rolled a metal cart of supplies past Harper's kennel. The squeaky wheels hit a patch of uneven floor and rattled against the tiles. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. In a single breath, Harper went rigid. Her ears flattened and her body tensed like a coiled spring. A second later, she bolted not in the wild, frantic way of an animal fleeing, but with controlled panic, like someone trained to survive pain. She slammed herself into the corner of the kennel, claws scraping hard against the plexiglass, her growl low and primal, rising into a frantic bark that reverberated through the clinic like an alarm. Cassie froze. So did everyone else. Annie Delgado rushed in within seconds, her coat still unbuttoned, hair pulled into a messy bun from the long morning shift. Her eyes, however, were razor sharp. "Back off the cart!" she shouted, guiding Cassie away with one arm, while slowly kneeling in front of Harper's kennel. The German Shepherd was pressed so tightly into the corner that her back legs were trembling under the strain. Her pupils were wide, black oceans of fear. "Harper," Annie said softly now. "It's okay. It's not him. You're safe." It took 5 full minutes for Harper to stop barking, 10 for her to breathe without panting, and nearly 20 before she sat down again. Annie didn't leave her side. She just waited, hand on the glass, saying nothing. Later, when things had calmed, Annie called Mason to the back exam room. He arrived within 10 minutes, his cruiser parked askew in front of the clinic, boots damp from the melting frost outside. "What happened?" he asked, crouching beside Harper's open kennel, his hand brushing gently against her fur. She pressed her nose into his jacket without a sound. Annie recounted the incident. Then she exhaled slowly and said, "I want to scan her again." Mason frowned. "I thought her chip came back blank." "Maybe, or maybe it wasn't scanned properly. Trauma affects skin tissue, it could have shifted." Mason gave a slow nod. Annie fetched the scanner. This time, she ran it more deliberately. Behind the shoulder blades, down the spine, across the ribs. Nothing at first. Then, just above the left flank, it beeped. The clinic printer chirped. Annie pulled the paper and squinted. "Well," she said, voice low, "she's not from here." The registry data came back to a shelter in Boise, Idaho. The dog had been listed under the name Daisy, with adoption paperwork filed almost 8 months prior. The adopter? A man named Troy R. Hensley. Age 33. No known address currently on file. Last known phone number disconnected. Mason leaned over her shoulder, eyes scanning the data. "I've heard that name," he muttered. "Hensley. That came up in the Northern District's investigation last year. Illegal animal fights rings in Idaho, eastern Oregon, up into Montana." Annie's hands tightened around the paper. "That's who had her?" "She wasn't a stray," Mason said. "She was property, discarded when she stopped performing, or got hurt." Annie stared back into the kennel, where Harper now lay curled, her body taut but still, like a soldier waiting for the next battle. Her ears twitched at the sound of their voices, but she didn't move. That afternoon, Mason drove straight to the Cedar Brook Police Department. The building was modest brick front, one level, with a flagpole that hadn't flown a new banner in years. Inside, Chief Raymond Lister was leaning over a stack of case files, his tie loosened, silver hair combed back like a soldier who never left the field. Ray was in his late 50s, tall, wiry, with a voice that rarely rose above a gravelly murmur. He'd been chief in Cedar Brook for 12 years, known for his precision and for rarely chasing cases without evidence. But Mason had earned his respect. That meant something. "I need to talk to someone in animal crimes or narcotics," Mason said, tossing the paper onto the desk. "Harper, the dog we pulled from the yard, she's chipped. Traced back to Idaho. Name matches a person linked to underground dogfighting." Ray rubbed his temples. "This town's barely got a K-9 unit. You want to chase a case across 3 states? "No," Mason said. "I want to protect what's already crossed into ours." The chief paused, then reached for his phone. "I'll make a call." Later that night, Mason returned home late. Finn was already asleep. A book slipped from his hand to the floor beside the bed. Harper lay curled beside him, her head resting on the boy's feet. Mason stood in the doorway a long moment, watching them. Then he moved quietly to the living room, where Annie was seated on the couch, flipping through a manila folder. "I got confirmation," she said. "The vet at Boise Rescue ID'd Harper. Said she was a quiet pup when they adopted her out. Sweet, obedient, no history of aggression." "Of course not," Mason replied. "She was trained to submit." Annie looked up, eyes clouded. "How does someone do that to a dog like her?" Mason didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and handed her a photo one he'd taken at the junkyard the day before. It showed the metal crate, now empty, the words, "She still believes," still jagged in the rusted wall. Annie's face shifted. "You think she wrote it?" "I don't know," Mason said. "But if it wasn't her, someone loved her once. Enough to leave a message." They sat in silence. Then Annie whispered, "Or someone couldn't bear to throw her away without trying to tell the truth." Mason didn't respond. His eyes were on the hallway, where a boy had begun to dream again, and a dog had learned how to stay. It had been 3 weeks since Harper's chip had revealed the truth, and yet every day with her still felt like the quiet unraveling of a mystery no one wanted to face. She was healing, her wounds closing, her ribs no longer visible beneath her softening coat, but her eyes still carried shadows, and her ears perked too sharply at sudden sounds. On a Tuesday morning, the clinic's door chimed with the entrance of Deputy Rory Keene, a man in his early 30s with a wide frame, close-cropped ginger hair, and a voice as calm as river water. He wasn't known for small talk, but he had a reputation for diligence and a quiet fondness for animals. Today, though, his face was tight with something heavier. Mason met him in the side office near the recovery kennels. "What is it?" "We pulled something from the Idaho file," Rory said, lowering his voice. "A jacket, torn, found during the seizure of Hensley's property. It was returned as evidence somehow, made its way into the surplus archive we share with county." He held out a clear plastic bag. Inside was a tattered olive green coat, frayed at the collar, dried stains along the sleeve. Harper, resting a few feet away, stiffened. Mason stepped back, voice low. "Let's try something." They took Harper outside for the first time in days, walking her slowly toward the western edge of Cedar Brook, where the forest began to reclaim the roads. The tall pines narrowed into clustered silence, and the sun, though bright, barely touched the ground through the thick canopy. Finn trailed behind, his boots crunching softly against the pine needles. Halfway down the dirt path, Harper's gait changed. She began to slow, ears lifting, nose twitching, as if catching something old and buried. When they reached the clearing, a wide patch of moss and scattered stone, Mason pulled the jacket from his bag and knelt. The second Harper saw it, her body went still. Her tail dropped. She stared. Then, without a sound, she lowered her head and sniffed once. The shift was immediate. She growled, not out of confusion, not out of fear, but recognition. Then she lunged, not wild, but purposeful, dragging her leash forward with force Mason hadn't seen before. She pulled toward the northern edge of the clearing, where thick brush swallowed an old deer path few still used. Her bark came sharp, urgent. "She knows something," Mason murmured. Rory radioed in for backup, then followed as Mason and Harper led the way. The path wound deeper into the woods until it broke into a clearing barely visible from any road. There, shrouded beneath branches and shadow, stood an old hunting shelter, half wood, half canvas, sagging, but intact. Harper froze just before it, barking again, her body coiled tight. Mason raised his hand. "Rory, stay behind me." He pushed the door open. Inside, the smell hit first sweat, decay, old metal. The floor was littered with empty cans, chewed straps, a broken dog bowl. In the far corner, a steel rod leaned against the wall, smeared dark. Beneath it, the unmistakable shape of a blood-stained collar. Rory stepped inside behind him. "Jesus!" They collected everything, every scrap, the rope, the muzzle tucked beneath the cot, even the claw marks on the wooden post, where something had once fought to get free. Outside, Harper sat trembling, eyes fixed on the door. But she didn't retreat. She didn't run. She had brought them here. That night, while the evidence was processed and the arrest warrant prepared, Mason sat in the clinic with Finn and Harper curled together on the rug. Finn was quiet, eyes watching Harper's slow breathing. Then the phone rang. They had found him. Troy Hensley had resurfaced 3 counties south, living under an alias, working at a storage facility near the interstate. The arrest happened fast. The moment the handcuffs clicked, he muttered something about dumb mutts and that white freak. Mason was there to hear it. He didn't flinch. But later, when they brought Troy through the station gate, Finn was waiting behind the fence, standing with Annie, who had insisted they deserved closure. Hensley stumbled when he saw Harper. The dog stood beside Mason, alert but calm. And from behind the fence, a child's voice rang out, clear, sharp, and loud. "Don't hurt her!" Everyone froze. Mason turned. Finn was gripping the fence tightly, his little hands balled into fists, his chest heaving with breath. Harper turned too, ears twitching. And then, for the first time in weeks, "You okay?" Finn nodded. "She saved me," he whispered. "I had to say it." Mason looked down at Harper, who was watching the boy like he'd just turned on a light in the middle of a dark room. "You did," Mason said. "Both of you did." 60 days had passed since the arrest. 60 days of slow mornings and gentle nights. 60 days of healing, not just for Harper, but for everyone she had quietly rearranged just by staying. The town of Cedarbrook, wrapped in its yearly patchwork of orange leaves and chimney smoke, was preparing for the autumn jubilee, a tradition as old as the trees. Booths lined the park, hay bales stacked near the bandstand, and the scent of caramel apples mingled with the earthy musk of pine and soil. It was the kind of festival where the entire town seemed to breathe together, forgetting the weight of what had come before. Mason stood near the gazebo in his off-duty flannel, sleeves rolled to his elbows. His hair was longer now, his beard more salt than pepper, but there was something lighter in the way he stood, a man who'd finally stopped holding his breath. He scanned the crowd until his eyes settled on a familiar shape. Finn. The boy was standing at the edge of the small stage, his hands holding a folded paper that fluttered gently in the breeze. He was wearing a soft blue sweater Annie had knit for him. She had surprised them both one morning with it, claiming it had been therapy to make something that didn't bleed. His dark eyes searched the field nervously. Beside him, Harper sat poised, ears alert but relaxed, her black and tan coat gleaming beneath the weak October sun. Around her neck was a new collar navy blue leather, hand-stitched by Eloise, who had quietly taken to stopping by the clinic on Tuesday afternoons, with jars of jam and warm advice. Annie stood in the front row, her long cardigan fluttering behind her like a cape. She looked taller than usual, though it might have just been the proud way she held herself. Her eyes never left Finn. A few paces away, Eloise was seated on a wooden bench, her walking cane resting beside her. She wore a wool coat buttoned to the chin and a small velvet hat pinned just above her temple. Her lips trembled as she watched the boy take a step forward. The crowd fell quiet. Finn glanced down at Harper, then unfolded the paper with careful fingers. Mason could see him take a deep breath. And then, clear and steady, the boy read, "Sometimes the quietest friend hears the loudest fears. Sometimes the one who never speaks is the one who listens best. She didn't bark when I was scared. She didn't chase me when I ran. She just waited. And because of that, I came back." A long pause, then a final line, spoken softer than the rest. "Thank you for giving me my voice, Harper." There was no applause, not right away. Just a stillness so wide it seemed the forest itself had stopped to listen. And then, like a wave, it came, cheers, soft claps, a few tearful whistles. Annie wiped her eyes. Eloise bowed her head. And Mason? He didn't move. He just watched Harper nuzzle Finn's leg, and Finn smiled back without hesitation. After the ceremony, as children ran between booths and old men told jokes near the cider press, Harper darted through the grass in circles. She wasn't chasing anyone or anything. She simply ran tongue out, tail up, her whole body moving with a freedom she'd never been allowed to know. In her mouth, she carried an old stuffed fox mended twice now by Annie, who had taken the task on like sacred duty. One ear still drooped, its pink thread visible from a distance. Finn followed behind her, laughing in short bursts. It wasn't the awkward sound of a child learning to laugh again. It was bright, full, the kind of laugh you felt in your ribs. They ran until the sky turned gold. Near the edge of the field, Mason leaned against a pine post, hands in his pockets. Annie stepped beside him, a paper cup of cider in one hand. Her hair was down, cheeks pink from the wind. "She's not a rescue dog," Annie said, not looking at him. "She's walking hope." Mason nodded. She didn't save him with noise or tricks. She just stayed. That's what hope does, Annie said. It stays until we're ready to see it. Across the lawn, Eloise was surrounded by children, her cane forgotten as she pointed out leaves and told them their Latin names. Mason smiled, then turned back to the scene ahead. Harper had slowed now, lying in the grass, her head between her paws, the fox beneath her chin. Finn sat beside her, drawing something in a notebook. Occasionally, he'd look up and talk to her, quietly, confidently, as if narrating a secret world only they shared. And then the sun broke through. For the first time in weeks, real sunlight spilled through the branches overhead, lighting the grass like something sacred. It struck Harper's black and tan coat and made her glow. Mason felt the warmth on his face, and for the first time in what felt like years, he didn't flinch from it. They didn't need to leave Cedarbrook anymore. They didn't need to start over, because sometimes healing doesn't happen in a hospital or courtroom. Sometimes it grows from soil and silence and the brush of a paw on your knee. Sometimes home isn't a place, it's a presence, and it had been here all along. Sometimes the most extraordinary miracles don't roar, they whisper. They arrive not with grand gestures, but in the trembling body of a rescued dog, in the shy smile of a child learning to trust again, or in the quiet decision of someone who simply refuses to give up. Harper didn't just find a home, she helped rebuild one. Through her, a father found his son's voice, a town found its heartbeat, and, maybe, we found a reminder we all needed, that even in a broken world, love still shows up, soft, steady, and willing to wait. So, if Harper's journey touched something in you, share her story with someone who needs to believe in light again. Leave a comment to tell us how she reminded you of your own turning point. And if you believe that hope has 4 legs and never asks for anything but kindness, type Amen below. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of quiet redemption. May God bless you and the ones who stay beside us, even when we're lost.